Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics,
good morning, everyone.
Area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes.
Hello, the technicians. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. And welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter. I know Jim Fitzpatrick is ready. And once again, let me also remind everyone that we are being recorded and we are also live on other platforms, Facebook Live, Microsoft Teams, and YouTube, and then also on our website. Kindly use the chat, as always, for networking and the Q&A functionality for your questions. You can also select the language of your choice from the interpretation section. Let me once again also acknowledge sponsors and partners who have made this possible. So here we're talking about TechnoServe, Benin Cashew, Cashew Info, GIZ.com Cashew, SNI, Pro Cashew, and Intersnack. Without much ado, Jim Fitzpatrick, I see you are ready, and today's title is Markets and Cashewnomics. Kindly take us through and bring us the knowledge that we deserve for the sector. I know it's been almost 2-3 weeks since we had an exchange, and a lot might have changed by then. So, Jim Fitzpatrick, please, the ball is in your court.
Morning, Ernest. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this is number 7, actually, the 7 market encounter of this season, and you're very welcome to that. Today, we're going to talk about the market, of course, as always, and we're going to start a series of 3 different subjects, loosely called cashewnomics. And today, we're going to talk about one really basic aspect of this market, which is the comparison between India and Vietnam, 2 very different cashew markets, 2 very different countries. Later, in the coming weeks, we're going to also have 2 other sessions on cashewnomics, one covering processing in Africa, and the final one will be about consumption of cashew nuts, cashew nut kernels in particular, worldwide. And it's often the case that we talk a lot about markets. We talk a lot about India, we talk a lot about Vietnam, but often in Africa, I find that people are not particularly well informed about those countries, and the myths and the rumors and the legends tend to dominate the discussion. So we're hoping through those 3 sessions to nail down some reality, to offer some opinion, and maybe give some clues, primarily with the objective of supporting the development of the African cashew sector by learning lessons from the leading countries in processing. So let's have a look at the markets. Let's have a look at the crops, and we'll update our crop news and crop forecasts for 2021. Well, the news as the Vietnamese crop comes to an end is not particularly good. It does look as if the crop is less than even we expected. We've been saying since the 10th of February that the Vietnamese crop was much lower than anticipated, and it looks now as if it could be up to 30% lower than last year. That, on the face of it, sounds like a disaster, and of course it is for the growers of cashews in Vietnam. But in the world picture, that's a loss of about 3.8% of the world crop. So this should not be taken to mean anything other than a relatively small reduction in production in one single country. So bear in mind, Vietnam's position as a processor and exporter is far ahead of its position as a grower, and that's one of the subjects we'll talk about later on in the India versus Vietnam section. If we look in India, certainly the impact of the lockdown is now beginning to bite. Shocking developments in India related to COVID-19. And we'll just stick to cashew terms, and it's rather selfish, I know, but let's just talk about the impact on cashews for now. And that's definitely going to reduce processing. So the food business can continue. The movement of food and the processing and preparation of food products can continue, but obviously within the current restrictions it's likely that the volume to be processed will be reduced. And it may also, as we saw last year, it may also impact the crop that will eventually be harvested in India. There are no absolute categoric figures on that right now, but it seems logical that we would get an impact. I think it's also important in India to remember that although there was a serious lockdown last year, the current situation is very different. It's much worse. And the reaction to it, although coming rather late, is going to be much different. In the world's leading grower of cashews, Côte d'Ivoire, the size of the crop, it looks as if it's lower than 800,000 tons now. We're going to put a figure of about 760,000 tons as an estimate on the crop. It's difficult to estimate the crop in Côte d'Ivoire, particularly at this time of year, but it does look, indications from the market tell us, and reports tell us that this crop is much lower than expected. And the major impact of that, of course, is that we started with an estimate way back, official estimate of about 900,000 tons, which looks incredibly inaccurate now, of course. So in all three countries, we're looking at a reduced production, probably in India rather than certainly, but certainly in the other two countries, reduced on last year and reduced on the earlier estimates. So let's look a little bit more closely in some of the West African countries. And I'll just mention again, when you look at this map of West Africa, you can see the red arrows, that's informal or illegal trade. The black arrows is formal or legal trade, movement of product from, for example, Mali and Burkina through Ghana, through Benin, through Togo for export. And the ships are obviously the points of shipment. If we look at the different countries, Nigeria, our reports locally tell us that the crop has been a little bit slower to arrive. They tell us that about 160,000 tons are in. Quality, as you would expect, is falling. And that there are indications now that the crop may be lower. We have to be very careful forecasting in Nigeria. The fact that the crop appears lower at this point in time may or may not turn out to be the case. Certainly, there's certainly disruptions in the movement of product at the moment, as there are in many of the ports, not only in West Africa, but all around the world. If we look in Benin, a clearer picture as the crop comes to an end, we still would stick with the estimate of about 130,000 tons. Quality at this time of year falls and prices naturally follow. I'm told that over 775,000 tons has been shipped. A lot of that to India, of course. The Indian buyers like RCN from Benin, and you can understand why, given the quality and the processing characteristics. Almost coming to an end. If we look in Ghana, similar situation. What trade is going on is now at lower prices as the season has come to an end, essentially. A crop estimate of 120,000 tons. We're taking, that's based on trade figures. There are other higher estimates, which we just find difficult to justify, and we're going to stick with that number until somebody proves different. In Burkina, the availability is declining. We would expect prices to ease at this time of year, so I don't think you should read anything into lower prices at the farm gate in Burkina Faso other than lower quality. It appears the crop was pretty good this year, but difficult trading conditions. In Mali, our local reporters tell us that 70,000 tons has already been exported, which is remarkable. The prices at the farm gate remain steady. Virtually all of the production of Mali is exported. There's very little processing in the country, and it goes out in various directions through other countries, as Mali doesn't have a port. If we look in what's becoming now the focus of attention, probably the two focuses of attention in West Africa would be Côte d'Ivoire for the time being, and the developments there, and Guinea-Bissau as the season starts to. It's actually being launched quite slowly. There seems to be a lot of discussions around various issues, not least of which is taxation. A good crop is expected, The farm gate prices are 550 to 625 at the moment, we're told, which is competitive. And it's a slow start to the season. We'll be keeping a close eye on shipments and on the vessel rotation and the availability of vessels in not only in Guinea-Bissau, but also in Senegal and the Gambia over the coming weeks, because that could be a very important factor in determining when this raw nuts become available. And as we saw last year, when you get disruption in Guinea-Bissau to shipments, it tends to be a case that that product either is smuggled out through another country or doesn't make it to the market. So last year, I think in the end, we were looking at about 140,000 tons from a normal production of about 180,000 tons. So generally in West Africa, as we look through the countries, we see a relatively normal situation, perhaps in some countries the crop a little bit slower to come to market than you might have expected. I don't think that's any surprise. Bear in mind, buyers came to the market later, cash came to the market later, and therefore it's not a surprise that product finds its way to the ports and the processes a little bit more slowly. Good crops. Côte d'Ivoire is the exception. I suppose, on the other hand, if the high forecast hadn't been made at 900,000 tons, we may not have been as surprised as we are by the current figure. If we look at farm gate prices in West Africa, we can see, generally speaking, prices have eased. I've just taken 4 countries for the time being. If we look in Mali, prices have slipped mainly on quality decline at the time, which is normal at this time of year. Similarly in Burkina Faso, Ghana, not much trade, of course, now that we're into May, but prices are relatively stable. It's only in Côte d'Ivoire where we have the pressure on the market, essentially pressure from exporters trying to cover their positions, has spiked the market up, made life quite difficult, not only for themselves, but also for the local processors. And it's interesting, and maybe something to reflect on, that the country which is the most advanced in processing in West Africa is also the country where the greatest difficulty is being felt in procuring RCN locally. And despite subsidies, despite various regulations and controls, these last couple of weeks have been difficult for independent processors in Côte d'Ivoire. It may well be that it's not about regulation, that it's about enforcement and management. So overall, looking at West Africa, we've revised our production estimates a little, and you'll see if you've been following these events, you'll notice that we have reduced our production estimates. So we're now forecasting that there will be a lower crop this year, mostly due to the situation in Côte d'Ivoire, reduced crop, but also due to probably a lower crop in Nigeria. Elsewhere, it looks pretty good, average to good, let's say. Will this have a major impact on the market? If we were just talking about a reduction of 50,000 tons in Côte d'Ivoire or 25,000 tons in Nigeria, you'd definitely say no. But if we were looking to combine that with the reduced crop in Vietnam, you'd say this could actually begin to have an impact. Now, we'd also have to put in that if there were problems in India, but India is complex because we're talking about disruption not only to the harvest, but also to consumption, then you might be looking at this and thinking that there would be some, perhaps not shortage, but some tightness of supply to continue as the year goes on. Let's try and apply that to the overall situation around the world, and you'll see that our estimate of the crop now has slipped again. Our high estimate is 3.67 million tons. Our low estimate is 3.42 million tons. That's down a little on our earlier estimates. And it's down because we've reduced, as I've said, the reduction of the Vietnamese crop earlier. Reduced crop in Côte d'Ivoire. Earlier we were never really looking at 900,000 tons. We were thinking 850 was reasonable, but certainly that's not going to happen now. So that's reduced. India, we don't know. I mean, all indications are that the growing of cashews in India this year has been quite successful. The problem will be in the harvesting and the delivery of that product to market in the midst of a very severe surge in COVID-19, in the midst of regulation. And it may well be that the worst of that is still to come. Nigeria, we've reduced our estimate of the crop based on local reports, and increases in Mali and slight increase also in Cambodia. The increase in Cambodia, by the way, is not the kind of increase that has been recorded in the import figures in Vietnam. It's a much smaller increase. We increased our estimate by about 10,000 tons. So overall, we're looking at a lower crop. Still serious questions in India. And until we get those answered, we won't really know what the final outturn would be. Let's have a look at demand and consumption. And this week, rather than looking at the statistics, I'm going to just look at the prices. So looking at RCN prices, again, focused on West Africa and the average across those countries that supply RCN to processors. And if we look at the trend in prices since the start of the season, in most countries we see an upward trend, and you'll notice that in Benin and in Ghana, you see a dip towards the end. Well, that's going to happen everywhere, because as quality goes down, so does the product price. Elsewhere, increase in Nigeria. But when we look at this overall situation, we're looking at a market which has not quite returned to the rather ambitious price ambition of early in the season, offers that were made early on, but it's getting there. And if we look at this market and consider where we were compared to last year and the years before. So this chart is tracking 4 West African countries. This would be the offered price of raw cashew nuts on a custom freight India and Vietnam basis from February 16 until this week. And then we have a world average, which also includes other countries that would supply, but I don't like to put too many lines on the chart. So the average is a calculation based on the offered quality and the offered price. What we see in this situation is that prices now have returned to levels of, let's say, what might have last been described as a normal market at the beginning of the 2019 season. During last year, we saw very low prices for most of the early part of the season. And this in a way was a false market. As it turned out, there was no real justification for these very low prices, neither in terms of production, nor in terms of any decline in demand. And we know at that time too that cashew kernels prices were rather illogically low, let's say, at that moment. So we're now back at prices that we last saw in May of 2019. The market, as the season moves on, and we're moving further west in West Africa as the weeks go on, the market would appear to be relatively stable. Now, the problem with it is, of course, and what holds RCN prices is that these prices, to try and make a calculation from these current levels of price through to cashew kernels for processors, this is not a great calculation. And that is likely to, I think, keep something of a lid on the prices of RCN, regardless of what happens. So really at this stage, and as the year goes on, what tends to happen is that the kernel's price tends to be the most influential factor. After we get probably through the end of May, after the season in nearly every country is finished, we're then talking about what a kernel's doing. And don't forget that in the second half of the year, the product is owned by a very different group of businesses and group of people, much stronger in their holding power, much better financed, and much more likely not to sell under pressure, unlike farmers and small traders in West Africa especially, but also in other countries during the early part of the year. If we look at kernels prices, you can see the red dotted line is our benchmark grade WW320s, and it tracks prices back over the same period, roughly back to 2016 season. And we can see that prices have been stuck in a relatively narrow range, particularly if we were to exclude this little February-March dip during last year, this kind of illogical dip in prices down to around $2.75, which happened again in February for unknown reasons, at least unknown to me. And if we look at this, we're looking at a situation, high of the market, 335, the average price, 305. So that means today, if you want to buy 320s from a good packer in West Africa, a good packer in India or in Vietnam, you're going to pay more than the 2-year average, which could be a signal that prices may well be ready to move on a little bit further. The low price seems a long way behind us now, $2.75. I think we can probably rule out a return to the low prices, certainly during this season. There seems no reason for that. Demand seems good. Recovery on prices, possibly. Could we see a new 2-year high before the end of the season? I'm pretty convinced we could. That means more than 335, maybe 340 to 350 as a range. There's no sign that there's any taste in the market for any kind of speculative bubble or any sharp increase in prices at the moment. But there's plenty of sign that there's genuine buyers there who have some business to do, and that processors are reluctant, given the price of their raw material and given the availability of the raw material in the immediate future in the next few weeks, they're pretty reluctant to make any aggressive sales offers. If we look at what I think is a more pertinent event over the last couple of weeks, and which is really significant, both for the processing margins and for the market in general, is that the gap between the brokens and the whole grades has been narrowing again. And this is something that's been long awaited for. So you can see on the radar chart, which is showing the gap. So the further out this blue section, which is the pieces, or the red section, which is the splits, goes from the center, the greater the gap between those grades and 320s. And so therefore, what you see in this is that there are 3 significant periods of very high differentials, and they often follow major increases in price. And they often follow one of those big price bubbles. So we look back at 2011, 2017, of course, and 2008, and you get these surges in price bubbles, and then essentially after that, a collapse in the value of brokens. But if we look at the chart, we can see that firstly on LWPs, that are actually, to be honest, more accurately in this case, it's LPs, because it's based on Vietnam, this particular chart. So we're talking about LPs, and LPs are not LWPs in terms of quality. So looking at that, you can see that at the moment, the prices for LPs, although they're higher than they have been, and although the differential has narrowed, we're still really out at a rather wide differential. Whereas if we look at the splits, the bottom of the 2 red arrows, you can see that we're now getting back into a range much more representative of market prices at different periods over the last 3 years. So this may well be a signal that the steep discounts for brokens are gone. Now, if the differential, looking at this and analyzing the differentials, there's 2 ways this differential can change. And when we looked at it, you find either the price of brokens becomes very weak and brokens fall relative to 320s, even if 320s are stable. So that is a situation that we've seen after the 2017 price bubble. Brokens became very weak, and even when 320s had found the bottom, brokens still fell away. So LPs got to $1, even below $1 a pound at one stage, even though 320s had stabilized. what we're seeing now is we're seeing the relative value of brokens increase, even at a time when WW320s are relatively strong to where they've been over the past 2 years. So 320s we took an average price of 318, taking the top packer for forward positions, taking a range of them, compared to the average price over the past 2 years of 305 for the same parity. That would be relatively strong. And we look at brokens. Brokens rising when 320s are strong is an indicator. Now, this is clearly something that's related to the international supply of brokens. This is not something that relates to the domestic market in India, which is strongly protected, and you have a completely different price structure. So just in case you're not aware, in India, you're looking at 320 prices, 360, 370, maybe even more than that at times, even when the international price would be 315, 320 or lower. So, and that also applies on brokens. So it's important to understand that, and that's the reason I used LPs for the benchmark here, rather than the higher quality LWPs. So there's light at the end of the tunnel, maybe, for processors who've had some difficulty selling their broken cashews. Factors to watch over the coming weeks. Number one, India. Big question. There's no doubt that it will calm the demand for kernels in India, at least in the short term. Last year, mind you, there was a pretty good performance of demand in India after the lockdowns. Depends on how long it lasts and how deep it cuts. It is difficult, I think, for Indian processors to make decisions. They have their own crop coming in, so are they likely to chase the RCN market? Now, I don't think so. The big question would be, will it also impact the crop? So in a month or 2 months from now, will Indian buyers need to come back to the market? Where will that RCN be? So I think at the same time, we can say that post-crisis, and it will, of course, come to an end, that we could expect demand in India to bounce back. And that wouldn't be surprising. There may even be a pent-up demand. So we need to watch that carefully. As long as India is quiet or not aggressively chasing RCN, then the current delays and slow decision-making in Guinea-Bissau will not be a major problem. Those, in a normal course of events, that could cause a problem in the market. But right now, I think that it's not a major problem. Indian buyers like to buy in Guinea-Bissau, but they're not particularly active at the moment. I think that the kernel's price has probably passed a point where there's an indication of a genuine upward trend. But I do want to say that I'm absolutely not saying that there's any big price moves coming. I think that this market can work its way logically upwards to where it probably would have been a year ago if it wasn't for the pandemic, which is around $3.40, $45 perhaps. Overall, if we look at the situation and taking into account that perhaps we will see reduced demand in India, but there's no sign of reduced demand in any other country around the world, it does look likely that for the first time in a long time, that the actual demand may exceed production in 2021. It's been often the case that cashew prices have risen sharply, but that's often happened in years when actually there was no imbalance between supply and demand. It doesn't actually mean that prices would be forced upwards either. Bear in mind that there are cashew crops coming to market month on month every year, except August and early September. So there's always a new supply coming to the market. So unless we get some other factors coming in, I don't think that this perhaps imbalance this year will have a major impact on prices. I still stick with the idea of prices around 340, 345 eventually. But what it is I think it's an indication of things to come in the future. I think that demand for cashews, especially in the West, especially in Europe, is not going to stop growing. And it's not going to stop growing quickly. And that this will become a time when we will see demand challenge production. And this could lead, of course, to more volatility eventually. Now, having said that, we can expect in countries, probably in Ghana, we could see over the next 3 to 5 years, we could see a major increase in production there. Possibly this situation in Nigeria and perhaps in Cote d'Ivoire as time goes on, but maybe not to the same extent. Looking more at the shorter term then, this series of contract so-called delays that probably and often turn into defaults of contract, this is going to have an impact on the market. So you've got two situations from an African processor's point of view at the moment. You've got two situations that can offer opportunity. On the one hand, you have difficulty shipping, particularly from East Asia to Europe and the United States, and increased transit times as a result. And secondly, you have defaults and delays on contracts from some processors. Now, bear in mind, some buyers will have bought those contracts at very low prices, and they may need to replace them. If they do, they can get deliveries from West Africa relatively quickly, and this is an opportunity. So a processor that's ready for that is in a great position. And we may well see, and indeed we have seen a lot of inquiries, particularly for shipment in the coming weeks, short-term prompt shipments. There's been a lot of inquiries there. Final question then on the market aspect, is demand returning for brokens? Certainly prices have improved on splits and LPs. On some of the smaller pieces, there has been some interesting inquiries in the market recently. That will change the overall processing calculation, but that it remains to be seen. But there is a question mark now, is demand returning for brokens? And that could be good news. It could be good news particularly for processors in West Africa, some of whom have had difficulty selling their brokens over the last few years. So in summary, the market, we need to watch India, crop coming in, lockdown, COVID-19 crisis. And of course, we need to look at this cashew kernels market. May would not be usually a major time for kernels buyers to make moves. It would be you may well see more demand in June, but at the same time, given the situation in terms of immediate availability of RCN and given the situation in terms of the delays and defaults, it could be an interesting time. And for African processors, I would say take a long look at what you're doing and be ready to take advantage, because it's a good opportunity to establish yourself with some of these buyers. So that's a quick overview of the market. It's not been a particularly busy couple of weeks since we last talked. It's been there's been a lot of national holidays in so many different countries, including this week, of course. I would hope that we'll see relatively stable prices and maybe a slow increase in prices as time goes on. Keep an eye on also, I haven't mentioned it on the slide, but keep an eye on farm gate prices in Cote d'Ivoire, how that develops in the coming weeks. Okay, so let's have a look at our second subject, so-called Cashewnomics, Vietnam versus India. So I got the idea to look at this because recently I had a conversation with some Indian processors, and I realized that perhaps we who focus on the African sector are not as well informed about the main consumer, India, the main processor, Vietnam, and both of whom major buyers of RCN, and that we should be. And I thought, let's go through some of the factors that affect these two huge markets, these two huge processors. These two countries determine the fate of African raw cashews every year. They, to a certain extent, fix the price. And it's important to understand what goes on in those countries. So let's start by having a look at the two countries. So in terms of production, first of all, we can see that India in blue. India will always be in blue throughout these slides, and Vietnam will always be in red. So if we look at the trend in production, Vietnamese production up until 2020 was rising quite nicely, but it has actually stabilized now, and this year's production is likely to be around the same level of 2010. In India, we have seen rising production. India is a far larger producer, second in the world only to Cote d'Ivoire now, and from year to year, the title of leading grower changes between the two countries. But India is a major grower of cashew nuts, as you know. If we look at consumption, and here we see the first major contrast between the two. So Indian consumption it's the largest consuming country in the world. It's a major consumer of cashew kernels, as you can see from the chart. And Vietnam is a tiny consumer of cashew nuts. There is just no real genuine consumption for such a large country. There's no major consumption of cashew nuts in Vietnam. That is a major contrast between the two countries. If we look at the import of raw cashew nuts and we contrast India and Vietnam, we can see that back in 2000, I think it was not until 2003 that Vietnam became a force in the RCN market. But 20 years ago, Vietnam did not import RCN. Imports grew over that decade, and they exploded in the last decade to the point where I think it was 2018, 1.6 million tons were imported. So a major importer emerged in the last 20 years, and that was Vietnam. So the growth in processing in Vietnam is driven by imports. India, whose crop has increased over the years, has maintained an increased trend, a strong increased trend in the import of RCN, but it is a little bit up and down within a range, probably between 650 and 850,000 tons, maybe even a little bit tighter than that, imports in India from year to year, depending on the domestic crop, depending on the carry-in stock from the previous year and consumption in the country. So Vietnam has emerged from 20 years ago, virtually no imports, the market dominated by India, to this incredible figure here. And of course, the RCN trade internationally has grown with that. And then we look at the kernel situation and the exports of kernels. Now, we saw a moment ago that India is a huge consumer of cashew kernels, but India's position as an exporter of cashew kernels has fallen over the last 20 years, but particularly over the last 10 years. The reasons for that are clear. The Indian domestic market is a better outlet for Indian cashew processors. But all the growth, virtually all the growth in the world market has been taken up by Vietnam. So Vietnam has become this enormous processor of cashew kernels and thus the world's largest exporter by far. So looking at the two, you have these very contrasting situations. India, a big producer, slowly growing. Vietnam, a small consumer. India, the world's largest consumer, with RCN, importing much greater volumes nowadays. India virtually, well, in 2020, maybe not exactly a fair representation, but virtually disappeared from the international stage in terms of kernels exports, unfortunately. And that has had a knock-on effect for buyers. If we look at India, production and supply, you can see the states on the screen. Generally, an upward trend, but slight volatility in the trend in the growing, and the volatility in the trend in growing cashews impacts the import trend. So as the production has dropped a little bit, imports tend to spike up. And we see in India a trend towards growing over the past 30 years has spread much more throughout the country. Once upon a time, very much concentrated very much in South India. That's spread much more over a long period of time, of course. We've seen processing develop in other parts of India. So you have two kinds of processors really now. You have processors that are close to the origin and the production of the product, and you have processors that are located much closer to markets. And you've even got some processors that are located in areas close to the consumption markets. The major cities are the red dots, but work entirely on, or almost entirely on, raw cashew nuts. So in the diverse area of production, diverse area of processing, enormous consumption spread across a huge country, 1.4 billion people. So what we see in India is this growth in consumption, very fast growth in consumption, and even more and more potential for that, and very slow growth in production. So the challenge for India would be to grow more cashews, or to import more cashews, and that's quite a difficult situation to be in. If we look at Vietnam, so we can see the blue bars show you Vietnamese production over the years since 2011, and you can see that it's been quite volatile. Now, I think consider we're only talking here about maybe a maximum of 450,000 tons. How can that have such an enormous impact on the world market? And that's something we'll talk about in a minute. But if we look at the crop and we look at the trends in imports, it's been a very strong trend. Now, there is always an element of carry-in year to year. So this is part of the volatility between 17 and 18 and between 19 and 20. Part of this volatility is about the carry-in stock. So when did the product arrive? Where was it bought? You have very concentrated production in Vietnam, and that may be one of the reasons why you tend to get occasionally, like 2017, maybe like 2021, you tend to get a very poor crop because the area is very concentrated. So over the years, if we looked back another decade, we would see higher production in Vietnam, and production has slipped back a little bit as some of the original trees were, rather than being replaced, were removed. Highly dependent on imports, more than 80% dependent on imports, and highly export-oriented on kernels, 98% export-oriented on kernels. We'll have a look. We have to look at Cambodia because if we look back at Vietnamese production and we see that Cambodia, the neighboring country, very closely located. And if we look at the production map in Cambodia, you can see the provinces of Cambodia, these areas here, that grow cashews in major volumes and supply those into Vietnam. Cambodian production is important because it has been increasing and because the crop arrives relatively early. So this production now is grown. We think this year that production in Cambodia is at least 270,000 tons. The vast bulk of that is exported to Vietnam by truck. It's literally a few hours away. Most of it's exported wet, undried product. It goes to Vietnam. There are some processing units opening up in Cambodia, and there will be more. But it's an important supplier at an important time of year. Just looking at this calendar, but the figures are old figures. So the early part of the season, February, March, is when you get the crop in Cambodia, and that's very, very important for Vietnam. If we look at the yield, and this is one of the reasons why we're going to see further increases in production in Cambodia, we see that Cambodian on-farm yields are very high compared to other areas. So we should look at average yield. You can see certainly on test plots in Vietnam and test plots in India, you see some very high yields. But if we look at the Vietnamese average versus the Cambodian average versus the India average, you see that Cambodia performs very well. And this new variety that they're growing, M23, is providing some outstanding results. And I think from an African perspective, we should also point out that how far ahead in terms of yield per hectare these countries are compared to West Africa and indeed East Africa. So Cambodia is important, and you can never really look at Vietnamese production and supply in the early part of the year without also considering Cambodia. So let's look at India in terms of its consumption, and we're seeing a very strong trend in consumption. So India is a big consumer. It consumes 85% of the cashews it processes, and that's increasing also. Prices are higher for kernels in India. The market is protected by import duties. The market is not a forward market, and that's an important point. It's a market that often is run on prompt shipment, spot trade. It's quality conscious. Indian consumers know their cashews, and they like good quality cashews. And processors know their cashews, and they're very interested to produce the right kind of cashews. Key factor about Indian demand is, of course, that brokens are widely used in many different applications. So just broadly speaking, we could say about 60% is ingredient, 40% is snack. If we said the same thing for Europe, it would be more than 80% snack, just to make the comparison. We can also see that India's exports of kernels have been declining. And that is really, I think, because some of the reasons to export have also been declining. The domestic market is a better market. It's a higher price market. You can deliver product quickly. You don't have to assemble container by container. You can recover your cash quickly. A lot of the reasons that were there in the past, cashews were always important in terms of the impact on the financial sector as a high value commodity. But a lot of these things, the import licensing, forex regulation, and so on, a lot of those regulations have disappeared. And so a lot of the incentives for Indian processors to export have disappeared with them. Having said that, Indian cashews are still high quality. Indian export cashews are still high quality, and they are preferred in markets, particularly that value a lighter color kernel, an even colored kernel, and taste. So markets in the Middle East, Japan in Asia, for example, is also a market that favors Indian cashews. So if we look at the comparison on export markets, and if we look at cashew kernels exports by origin, again, Vietnam in red, India in blue, you can see that Vietnam dominates, and it dominates to the extent where we in Europe depend on Vietnam for 75% of our cashew kernel imports in 2019, and the United States for 86%, and sometimes higher than that in certain months. It's been as high as 91%. And we see that exports from anywhere else, Brazil, African countries, have been relatively low. From Brazil, stable. From Africa, underlying growing, but actually quite volatile in some ways. So what we've seen is, as the Indian domestic market has grown, the Indian export market has declined, and Vietnam has taken not only the place of India, but it's taken the lion's share of all the growth in the international market, including high shares in virtually every market, particularly Europe, the United States, and of course China. It has a almost 100% share of that market. Now these factors change, and this is very much now from an African perspective. When we look at this in the early part of the season and we look at the dynamics, we have to consider, what do these factors mean? So we've said that Vietnam depends 80% on imports of RCN. So every year, Vietnam starts out by buying its own crop, about 20% of the need. Then it buys the Cambodian crop, about 16% of the need. But processors generally, because they supply markets in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, often have pre-sold. So they have major, as traders would call it, short position until they buy the RCN. Maybe those sales have been made weeks ago, maybe months ago, maybe longer in some cases. So that changes the psychology. They tend to focus on price, and this is where areas that have, let's say, a lower quality of RCN sell most of their product to Vietnam. Vietnamese buyers mainly rely on specialist traders and imports for the products. They wouldn't be integrated in the supply chain in the way that you might find some Indian buyers would now or would have been in the past. But if you look at this situation, here you have the largest exporter of kernels that only produces about 18% of the world crop, but starts every year, at least the major shippers start every year with major forward sales commitments. And this has a huge impact on their thinking, on the way they approach the market. And we saw that demonstrated, best of all, in 2017, where a poor crop in Vietnam caused prices to explode. Now, you see much better management of that situation this year. Maybe because the information came slower, maybe because the information was known far in advance. But you've seen a much better management this year, and maybe that's because of a certain consolidation in the sourcing of RCN too. Contrast that with India. About 55% of the RCN processed in India is imported material. If we look at the season and how the markets develop, initially India buys 45% of its needs between March and June in the domestic market, in a market that is higher priced than any other market in the world and is protected by import tariffs. Processors tend not to sell forward. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Indian market is much more a spot prompt market. That's not to say there aren't any forward sales, but generally speaking, you can buy and sell, and your whole risk profile is very different than if you've sold 9 months or 12 months forward to major buyers in the United States or in Europe. And we tend to see a much more detailed focus on quality of the RCN by Indian buyers. So you will see Indian buyers particularly like Benin RCN for its quality and its processing characteristics, Ghanaian RCN for the same reason, and Guinea-Bissau because of its high yield and its suitability for certain types of processing operations. So when we look at India, we see a bigger crop, a much bigger market, the biggest market, and protected price structures. Very different structure, very different psychology, very different approach to sourcing RCN. And sometimes I think in West Africa particularly, we may not have got that message that there is a huge contrast between these two. People often tend to just say, oh, it's the Indians or it's the Vietnamese, without really understanding what that means and how those contrasts change the thinking. So let's have a look at processing then, and we'll have a look across all kinds of different areas. If we look at processing capacity and the domestic production. So in Vietnam, as you know, production is low and processing is high. This gap between production and processing is very large. Not quite as pronounced in India, but nonetheless a big gap. The opposite applies in West Africa. Production is way ahead of the processing capacity, and then variations across the other major processing regions. If we look at the cost of processing, so this is taking a fixed cost of RCN. I've taken $1,200 per ton in this case. That's an FOB figure. And we've added on the cost of bringing the product to the processing plant, a notional cost of processing. So we're saying in West Africa, $600 per RCN ton to process. And I know some factories are well below that now, but I'm taking that figure to make the point that processing costs generally are higher at the moment in West Africa. Somewhere in between in India, that's to do with scale and the use of mechanization. And then probably the most competitive in Vietnam. So I've taken a figure of 200. Some people tell me it's lower than that, but I'm not sure that that is a fully costed figure when they reduce it below $200. So there's a competitiveness gap, but it's not actually as wide as sometimes thought. Particularly for African RCN processed in Vietnam. Clearly, for Vietnamese or Cambodian RCN processed in Vietnam, there is a big price gap. And African processors, therefore, to be competitive, would need to reduce their processing cost. But for most of the year, and bear in mind this calculation, Vietnam African RCN, applies to 80% of the RCN processed in Vietnam, the gap is not as challenging as is sometimes thought. If you can process efficiently and if you can get your costs down to competitive levels. So in summary, Vietnam, low cost of processing, but generally speaking, on average, a higher cost of access to raw material. So raw material cost is more important because you buy 80% of it. And that perhaps is a reason to focus on lower price, lower quality raw material. In India, a much higher cost of processing, but a protected domestic market, and generally a healthy industry, but very much these days the domestic industry. And in Africa, lower raw material costs, at least should be lower raw material costs if the supply chains are developed, but for now anyway, a higher cost of processing. That may change. There's really no reason why a factory that uses the same mechanized methods in Africa should have such a big gap. Yes, power is going to be more expensive, probably cash borrowings are going to be more expensive, but other factors should come into account. And of course, the reduction in the number of workers and the number of manual processing operators in the factory means that training costs and development of the necessary skills can be done that bit quicker too. So if we look at the cashew business in Vietnam and look at some of the key factors, we're looking at businesses that are a contrast, family owned on the one hand and corporate large processors on the other. They sell forward, they tend to speculate on RCN sourcing, or maybe more accurately, they're forced to speculate on RCN sourcing because they're forced to make forward sales. Tough times, losses probably in processing in 2017, probably some gains in the last 2 years. But smaller processors are definitely finding it more difficult to compete. It's difficult for Vietnamese businesses to invest abroad, and it's unlikely, despite some of the talk, that that industry could move to Africa. If we look at generally on economic factors, there is pressure on the costs of labor and, of course, on the cost of raw material. The state has a role throughout the sector, and it looks to me as if the state and the major trading company Tan Long has taken a much more strategic approach to the sourcing of raw material and a concentration of that. For example, that TNT group mentioned that it would source 600,000 tons of RCN in 2021, and that kind of consolidation has a big impact. And maybe some of the tightness of supply in Côte d'Ivoire today is a result of that kind of consolidation in the sourcing. So RCN for the Vietnamese sector is mainly sourced through traders. Speculation is a factor. Those traders have benefited hugely by the increase in the RCN trade. If we look at processing in Vietnam, there are different kinds of processors. We have our typical picture of a Vietnamese processor, large to very large, good food safety practice, low risk, perhaps outsourcing the shelling. And these factories are, let's say, our general picture of what happens in Vietnam. But there are also smaller factories with a full process, shelling all the way through to packing. And they have, if I was looking at the risk on these factories from a food safety point of view, I would say they're a low risk, maybe medium to low risk in those factories. And then we have packing centers, which buy raw material from other processors, and they would clean and pack the product only. These are different sized businesses. They're generally well certified, and there would be a low risk on food safety. And then there are some processing only units, which is shelling, mostly shelling, maybe shelling and feeding into one of these other types of businesses here. And these would probably be classified as being a risk in terms of food safety and indeed labour practice in those factories. So it is a much more diverse sector, the processing sector in Vietnam, than we sometimes actually consider. So I think in this contrast, India versus Vietnam, the key question really is what has made Vietnam dominant in the sector? So we did a kind of an analysis of this. And if you look at the factors involved, if we consider these are basic factors for successful cashew processing, things like the availability of raw material, things like the availability of workers and managers. If we look at key factors for Vietnam, and the key factors for Vietnam where they've really done well is in reducing the cost of processing, in particularly compared to India, in developing and using technology, in scaling up their process. So there are bigger factories, as I was saying a moment ago, there are big factories, even a medium factory in Vietnam might be described as a big factory elsewhere. Plenty of government support, much more direct government support. There are certain supports in India, just like there are in countries in West Africa, but it's been much more, and I'm talking now over the whole period. We're talking about the Vietnamese cashew industry, which really started to come to prominence around 1993. And in that period, we're talking about that. So it's not been on. Both countries have weaknesses in their production compared to their consumption or export in the case of Vietnam. Both countries have a dependence on import. But Vietnam has done well in reducing its cost of processing, mainly by the application of technology, good business practices, much more consolidated industry. And maybe within that, there's certain lessons for West African cashew development organizations and governments in how they want their sector to develop. So if we look at it overall, we can see that in Vietnam, it adapted to food safety certification, innovation, and forward sales early to meet buyers' needs. That's a key factor in the development of Vietnam, whereas India has been in a position where they've been able to do the opposite. They've been able to focus on the domestic market. For many years, innovation wasn't necessary, although that's not to say there isn't innovation in India. There's huge innovation in India in the cashew sector, but that needs to be maybe better applied, and factories need perhaps to mechanize if they were to, for example, want to re-establish their position as an exporter of kernels. But a lot of this is about perception. And so I thought I'd write up, let's have a look at some facts and let's have a look at some of the perception. So from the point of view of facts, Vietnam is always cheaper. But also kernel quality. If you take the quality of cashew kernels over the last 15, 20 years, you've definitely seen a decline in quality. There's no doubt about that, particularly colour, but also taste. If we look at the grading, so LPs are not the same as LWPs. WS are not the same as fancy splits. We have seen a general lowering of quality of cashew nuts. And it hasn't mattered because demand for this product has been very strong. Generally speaking, contract fidelity is lower. That is a fact. There are worrying factors on labour and social aspects of the industry in Vietnam. And if we think about this in a risk framework, the higher your dependence on a single origin for supply of kernels, the higher your risk. And these are very important factors, not only from the point of view of Vietnamese processors and protecting their sector, but also from the point of view of kernels buyers. And these factors point to opportunities for African processors too. So they're the facts. But if we look at the perception, and particularly perception held by regulators, financiers, and often processors themselves in African countries, you get these ideas. No one can compete with Vietnam. India is not interested in export customers. Indian factories are not certified. These are all perceptions that actually undermine the potential competitiveness, or at least the perception of the competitiveness of African processing. So certain perceptions have drawn buyers to these countries. Certain perceptions have drawn buyers up to, I would say, the last 3 years to close their minds to African processing and look much more at what appeared to be the obvious solution, which is to buy everything in Vietnam. But the perceptions don't necessarily match the reality. And as African processors and African promotion organizations, it's important to realize that. But Vietnam has been enormously successful. And let's have a look at some of the factors, because in here there may be some pointers for the African sector. First of all, technology. Right going back to the beginning, I first went to a cashew factory in Vietnam in 1993, and what I was struck by was I saw more machines in that factory than I'd ever seen in a cashew factory, and I'd been to a lot. There was a link to local technical schools and universities. There was a sharing of the innovation, and there was state support for that innovation. These were important factors. Today, of course, you can benefit from that by buying Vietnamese cashew machines. If you look in India, you'll see innovation, you'll see a lot of ideas, but you won't see this combination. And you will never have seen that combination. If we look in Vietnam, we see a structure that makes the development of the industry that bit more likely to succeed. Concentrated production, good organization, and a single-minded approach to export. We see a business culture that had an entrepreneurial style, a willingness to invest, and a kind of a flexibility and ambition from which I think African processing developers and regulators could learn a lot. We also see state support. From the very early days, there was state support, not only in innovation, as I've mentioned, but also in finance. That's changed over the years, but certainly there is a general support for the sector. It's a big employer, it's a good export earner, and promotion of that sector is important. Also, I think we have to look at something that's in the contrast to India. There's a necessity for export. There's a necessity without a domestic market, with rising labor cost, and with the use of technology means you need scale. To exploit technology to its best, you need to develop a sized process that makes sense for that technology. And so a lot of the development in Vietnam was through necessity. And I'm not sure that if Vietnamese planners today looked at the industry and thought that they would be dependent on maybe in 2021, 1.8 million tons of imported RCN, I'm not sure that they would be pleased with that outcome. But it has created a very large processing sector. So now they're faced with a different necessity, which is to secure the supply of raw material. What could change in Vietnam? We've talked a bit about what could change in India, which is more mechanization, more development of the sector, maybe some consolidation. What could change in Vietnam, and this is important for buyers of kernels and African processors too, I think more value-added kernels, more roasting, more packing, probably more sales to China. Chinese demand seems to be moving up. And whereas China could become a processor, it's not possible for China to grow large volumes of cashew. It's just geography and climate. I think we'll see much more strategic approach on RCN sourcing. We see signs of that already. Larger deals, maybe some investment in the supply chain. I feel that probably in Vietnam, we'll see a consolidation of processing. There will be fewer larger processors. And that may well mean more foreign direct investment in cashews, particularly in processing. And perhaps that will be industrial investment rather than trading companies integrating. But there are concerns. And if you remember, if you were with us 2 weeks ago, you will have heard Lars Shearer from Aldi talk about corporate responsibility and sustainability. And some of the concerns are arising. The dependence on one origin is important from a kernels buyer's point of view. So sustainability, by the way, it isn't just a word that means the environment. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about a whole range of factors that impact the future of the business. So dependence on one origin for kernels buyers is a problem. And that may be a problem that encourages development of processing elsewhere rather than further development of processing in Vietnam. There are questions about the livelihood of growers. So the farmers that grow the cashews in the world, 56% of them in Africa, their livelihoods. So although RCN prices have moved up sharply in the last 15 years, that periods of volatility are very difficult to deal with. It's very difficult to plan. It's very difficult to live if the price you receive one year is half the price you received the previous year. That's a very hard way to live. And that is a question for buyers of kernels and consumers of kernels. The environment, obviously planting trees is a positive factor for the environment. Processing, provided the byproducts are managed, can be environmentally neutral, but there is a risk there. And so developing processing needs full consideration of byproduct, particularly disposal of shells, the use of the cashew nut shell liquid. If we look at the RCN trade, certainly the carbon footprint of that trade is very high. It's unnecessarily high, and it's growing, and it has been growing for 20 years. I heard someone say recently that the sustainability factors don't add up. They do. Demonstrated when there is a problem in that origin. But that can happen, and particularly if we learn anything from the pandemic, it's simply that anything can happen. And let us say, imagine the situation if, for example, Vietnam had been badly affected by COVID-19, for example, in the way that India is affected today. How would our dependence of 80% on Vietnamese processing look then? So these are important factors, and this argument does stand up. People are concerned about employment and employment conditions, and of course they're concerned about their own supply chains. We see supply chains disrupted at the moment, and therefore we're looking at a situation where buyers might, at this moment, wish they had better supply of cashew kernels from other origins. Or let's say a better balance of their supply. Not to say that any origin doesn't do a good job for them, but to say that high dependence on one is a problem, and similarly on RCN. So when we look at this situation, India versus Vietnam, we see two very different markets, two very different processing structures, two very different consumption structures. And we need to take these things into account, particularly the motivation and the psychology of buying of RCN, especially when we consider February, March every year, and we look at crops in Africa and we look at position in Africa. We need to consider how buyers are thinking at that moment and the difference between how they might be thinking in India and how they might be thinking in Vietnam. Thank you very much indeed. It's good to talk to you. I'll hand you back to Ernest, see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, for this comprehensive analysis of the market and also of India, Vietnam, and also Cambodia. And very often we are talking about those countries without doing a better drill down to understand what is happening in there. To also do a recap, you have talked about four key trends that we see in the market. The about 1% downward reduction in the production estimates that we should keep in mind looking at the what is coming up now. And then again, you also secondly talked about the RCN prices, CFR India, Vietnam, back to May 2019 levels. And also coupled with that, the kernel prices, WW320, being well above 2-year average. And the fourth point you also mentioned was that there is also a narrowing of the gap between the prices of broken and wholes generally. And in your view, this is a good opportunity for processing in Africa. You've also talked about, as I mentioned earlier on, India and Vietnam, and also giving the pointers to why Vietnam has been very successful. You're talking about technology, sector structure, business culture, and then state support, among others. And I think these are very important things for the industry to note over here. Now, the key question that I want to ask is that between the two countries and looking at between Vietnam and India and looking at the state of processing in Africa today, is there any blueprint to arrive at the level of where Vietnam is? Is it a path towards Indian processing technology to arrive in Vietnam processing technology, or you think that looking at, and especially in Africa where there are many small-scale processes, is it the case that we should be looking at promoting this kind of small-scale processing, or rather straight away be looking at a big end like the Vietnamese did?
Well, pardon?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So, well, you asked me a question like that, you can expect me to pause for a moment.
I don't want it to appear as though you gave a prescription that Africa should go for the Vietnamese approach. But I think there are learnings from there for Africa. But then looking at how diverse the processing sector is, small scale, medium, large, and also what is out there, we want to know whether there is any path necessarily to arriving there.
Well, there's no formula here, but I think you're right, Ernest. You can take lessons from different countries. I mean, if you had, for example, Indian quality, Vietnamese technology and know-how, you'd have a very interesting mix. At the same time, I think that it is going to be more difficult simply because of striving to meet the cost of processing. It's going to be more difficult for smaller factories to compete. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways that smaller factories can compete. For example, it might be a case of looking at particular niche markets, like organic cashew nuts, for example, or fair trade cashew nuts. Or it could be a case that smaller factories can join together for export. So I'm not necessarily ruling out the place of small factories, but I do need to point out that it is very difficult to apply the benefits of the type of technology that's currently available in a very small factory. So you now come to the question of what is small. And if you ask me in cashews, what is small is 3,000 tons a year. I would think that's a small factory. So when someone talks about a 500-ton cashew factory, if that's a social enterprise, absolutely great idea. Go for it, but don't expect to make a lot of money out of it. If we're talking about financially sustainable and profitable businesses, we have to talk about a certain amount of scale that will allow the application of the technology and the management techniques. If we're talking about specific certified niche markets, or if we're talking about social enterprises, that's an entirely different matter. Now, people do mention things like clustering, lots of small factories working together for marketing, and these are all interesting ideas. But I think when we talk about clustering, for example, small factories, we have to also talk about how do you manage that, how do you preserve food safety, and whether or not you should, in those circumstances, add value. We're faced, in Africa, it's faced with an interesting challenge. You're trying to build an industry in probably now if we take the whole continent into account, you're probably looking at the 5th version of cashew processing in Africa. And this one is likely to be the most successful, I think, certainly since the 1970s when East Africa was the leader. So if we look at it today and we see a good mix of technology, whether that be from Vietnam or India or elsewhere, it's picking the right technology for the business, for the scale of the business, and for the environment. I would say one thing. There are a lot of myths. There's a lot of things talked about which are just not true in this business. You know, I've been listening to them for so many years. You'll never process successfully in Africa. And so I'm not even going to go into them. I don't want to repeat them. But we need to escape from those and to look at this as a hard business proposition. On the one hand, if that's what it is, we talk about scale and we talk about choice of technology. We talk about management, and we need to talk about the integration of the supply chain. At the other end of the scale, if we talk about social enterprises, and they're very relevant, particularly in some areas, we need to talk about all those factors, but we need to also talk about what makes those businesses different. Why do people buy that product? And they probably are not going to buy that product because of the price. There has to be another reason that encourages them to buy that product. It might be the impact. It could be simply marketing. But it is very important not just to take on the idea that either the idea, one, that the only factory that's worth building is 40,000 tons capacity. That's not true. Or on the other hand, that if it doesn't have a major social impact, it's not worth building. That's not true either. The impact on the economy and the society in general of a profitable local cashew factory is enormous. Maybe what's missing at times is that link back into the supply chain. Unfortunately, no, there's no simple answer to your question.
Well, it's understood. There is a question here from Lee, who is asking, is it that raw cashew in West Africa will back a new cycle of rocketing price, or simply it's totally manipulated by someone or hothead? I don't know what Lee means by that, but then do you understand it, Jim?
I do.
Or maybe I invite Lee also to.
No, I think it's a good and relevant question.
Very good.
No, I don't see a cycle of rocketing prices right now in the short term, and I don't see that either in the long term, because I think that although prices probably will rise in the long term, being 10 years, I think that eventually production will start to correct that. We probably will see some additional production. Is it being manipulated? Yeah, regularly, but not all the time. I mean, manipulation is something that you can do from time to time, manipulate the data, manipulate the market information, manipulate the reports to fix the market. That happens. But I don't think that overall the market is manipulated in a way that the value of the product is false. I think that the value of the product probably reflects its value in relation to other snack products. There are a lot of other cheap snack products in the world, and in relation to other nuts. Is it a hothead? So I'm going to take a hothead as being, a speculator. But yeah. I think there is a certain amount of speculation, of course, but less than there was previously. I think what's there right now is a concern or a fear that the supply could be disrupted and that factories will not be able to get enough raw nuts, and that sometimes creates some what might appear to be illogical reactions. I think at the same time, African cashew stakeholders need to recognize that what they hear is not necessarily a fair representation of the market. So if after the Tet holidays in Vietnam, you hear that the price of 320s has collapsed again to $2.75, I think, or maybe even less, as was reported, it was pretty obvious that wasn't right and it wasn't going to last for long. So sometimes we react to things when we know that those are only placed there to, I won't say manipulate the market, but I will say maybe just to test the water in the market.
All right.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, sure. Jim, you just to go back again to the factors you mentioned for the success of the Vietnamese industry. You talked about technology, sector structure, business culture, and state support, but I want to dwell on state support. We know how, the state, through very good policies, has impacted on the sector in La Côte d'Ivoire. But if you talk of state support in Vietnam, what specifically are these? And then are they more also along the lines of protective policies, as we see in India, to protect processes in those countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Are these the kind of policies that are emerging there in terms of state support? Or what is the nature of this?
Yeah, I mean, these days the interventions are far less direct than they would have been in the past. So you don't see subsidies, for example. I mean, processing subsidies are appropriate for a new industry. They're appropriate for a period of time, and they can make a great difference. But those wouldn't be appropriate in a mature and expanding business like you see in either Vietnam or in India. What you see is general support for the sector. So promotion, training, developing technology, supporting supply chain initiatives, maybe a certain amount of state-to-state trade support, creating the environment for business. India, slightly different. India has all of those kinds of things, but it also has, as it has in a number of different food products, it has a protected market so that it protects the processing industry by effectively ruling out the import of cashew kernels through high import duties. And that's valid in India. It simply because you have a sector in India that would be threatened with a huge flow of cashew kernels in from Vietnam due to the lower cost of processing. So that's the way that they choose to manage that. The unfortunate aspect of that might be that it doesn't encourage the domestic industry to improve its competitiveness. It protects it to a stage. So if you were regulating, you say, okay, we're going to exclude the import of kernels through tariffs for a number of years, but we're going to scale that down. So if you're a processor, you need to get yourself competitive within that period. But leaving it open-ended, whilst I have to accept it's needed by processors in India, leaving it open-ended does tend to, let's say, discourage development of the industry. So I think when we look at these policies, the things that are missing in West Africa, to my mind, would be the facilitation, which do exist in other countries, the facilitation of an environment which is conducive to the availability of investment capital and working capital in those countries. For example, the profile of the cashew business in West Africa as a high-risk industry is probably not as true as is seen by many financial institutions. Indeed, it's the lack of support from financial institutions who work on what they see in front of them, which is the profile of the industry presented to them. It's their lack of support that encourages speculation, encourages volatility in the market, which makes their risk profile for processing that bit higher. So they obviously prefer to lend money that quickly rotates and comes back to them and then goes out and finances a different crop. So that'd be an area which I would say is lacking at the moment, although some may say that the facilities are there just not taken up, and that might also be an argument.
Okay, thank you very much. I know you've touched on this issue already, the problem of COVID in India, and the impact there. But then the questioner wants to know whether there has been any impact in West Africa, particularly is it leading to less purchasing? But I think it's something you touched on. Maybe you can still elaborate a bit more on the commercialization, what is going on here with the season and the exports, whether we are on the same level or there are shortages here and there.
Well, I think that it wouldn't be surprising if Indian processors were a bit more reluctant to come to the market this year in the midst of the crisis in their own country. I think that's perfectly understandable. And that appears to be the case at the moment. That doesn't mean that traders won't buy with a view to supplying that product to the processors later on. I don't think so far that there's been an impact on trader shipments, but I think there has been an impact on the psychology of the market. And I don't think any Indian buyer today, given what's going on and the uncertainty created by the crisis in India, I don't think any buyer is going to chase the market from India right now. And this is one of the factors that's keeping RCN, international price of RCN, relatively stable. I mean, the offered price goes up and down $50 here and there, but there's been no sustained upward or indeed downward trend in that.
All right. Now I want to go into the issue of production in the two countries. We looked at production in particularly Vietnam, and we saw how volatile it has been in terms of growth. And we would like to find out, looking at what is going on in India and Vietnam today, is there any likelihood in the next 10 years for production to grow significantly? Because then that will be the game changer also at the end, because it looks like it is it's a particular point on which the two countries are really having issues in terms of importing large volumes of the crop they process, and then it also accounts for a higher part of the cost of the processing. Yeah,
I think that there will be an increase in production in India. I don't think it will be enough to meet India's needs, because Indian consumption of cashew nuts is likely to grow again. I mean, there's no doubt India will emerge eventually as one of the most powerful economies in the world. There are today 1.4 billion Indians, I think. So it's quite likely that consumption of cashew nuts in India, which is a core product, will increase, and that will drive production. But it's very unlikely that production will go from an annual growth of 2% per annum to anything like the level that may be seen in the growth in consumption. So they would probably need to replace imported RCN. Today, they would need to more than double their production. That means probably planting a lot of cashew trees, which are slow to offer crops and which are not really suitable on the best of land, so you can expect relatively low yields. The average yield in India is somewhere around about 800 kilos per hectare. So there's no indication that that's going to change dramatically. If we look in Vietnam, there may be a re-establishment of production, but I think that's unlikely. And we will see, if you take you take Vietnam, Cambodia together, I think Cambodian production will increase. I suspect you could see Cambodian production reach 400,000 tons in a foreseeable future. Certainly Vietnam will increase its production, but I don't think in any way likely to replace its import need. And if we look in West Africa, I'm sure we will see increases in Ghana. I'm pretty certain of that. Probably in Nigeria, perhaps in Benin, possibly in Cote d'Ivoire. But we are also getting to a stage where trees are aging now, and there will be a situation where a lot of older trees will need to be replaced. So it's quite demanding to plant new areas and replace older trees at the same time. And there is also the threat, and if we talk about the much longer term, there is the threat of climate change to the growing areas. So perhaps the growing area ends up moving a little bit further south. But that's a long-term consideration. So do I see a surge in production that either will replace the need for imports in India or Vietnam? I do not see that. Do I see a surge in production in West Africa? I do not see that. I do see production in West Africa continuing to rise. But the question is, will that match the growth in production, in consumption? Pardon me. And I think if I look at this over the next 10 years, I see consumption of cashews growing faster than production. And therefore we get into a tighter position in terms of the supply-demand balance.
Ernest. There is a question, and I believe this is a Vietnamese Tang, who is asking whether there is something that probably India might do that quickly can upset the balance in favor of India against Vietnam, because he's saying that in Vietnam, Vietnam has concerns if suddenly India makes some strange action or unpredictable ones, and whether from an insider opinion you think that there is anything that India can do suddenly to go ahead of Vietnam in terms of processing, especially. Will it come in the next 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I think that Indian technology for processing will develop more and more. That's one thing. But I don't think that's a game changer in the short term. I think that Indian export, like generally, I suspect Indian processors would like to establish their presence again in the export markets. But that would need perhaps some government incentives, maybe some processing incentives or processing zones. Can I see anything from India? No. What I can see from India is increasing consumption, and that is the aspect of the Indian sector that's most likely to upset the current status quo. I mean, if you're going to look for something that could upset Vietnamese dominance of processing, it's going to come from consumers and buyers who want to diversify their supply.
Right. The other question that I see also is talking about quality issues, quality of raw cashew nuts, and the fact that there is some kind of mixing of good and bad quality, and what exactly can be done about it. But I think it's also an issue of adhering to standards. Very often we see in most of the countries, buyers are going even to farmers' fields, buying from the farms and not allowing the nuts to be properly dried, and then only arriving in their export warehouses to do final drying and to record huge losses. So I think it is also more or less about how we can get governments to insist on points where they can do the buying, and also to have more education for farmers on the need to do drying fully. And again, as buyers, you have also to support in that, and to stop buying undried nuts and to buy it only when they have been dried, because we have a lot of development partners providing all this education. Governments through the extension services are also educating on the methods of harvesting and drying, and still we get this incursion of traders running in quickly to be ahead of each other and to buy without allowing them to properly dry. So I think it is more a shared responsibility to allow this to happen, because you cannot continue to have losses, some going 12-14%. As a result of not having it properly dried at a farmer level. So I think this is something that we continue to sensitize farmers through our development partners, also through government extension services. But again, the buyers who are buying for all these entities also have to be sensitized properly to know that they make losses. It is not good for the industry. It affects eventually the quality. And as a result, they have to make sure that they are allowing farmers to dry properly before they buy from them. So, Jim, I think this one...
I think that's important. There's a couple of factors on this. One thing that we generally don't do is we don't reward quality at the farm gate.
Yeah.
And that's a pity, because the incentive for a farmer to do a better post-harvest job is that he would get a better price. So you can't expect someone to do that additional work and reduce the weight of the product if they're not going to benefit by that. That's one thing. And I think the other aspect that needs to be borne in mind is that, what I call the pressure to fill the ship. If you're a commodity trader, which is what most RCN buyers are, they need to fill the ship. They need to buy product that will go on that ship and fulfill their contracts. This is not about quality. On the other hand, if you're a processor, knowing that you're fully responsible for the impact and the results of the products that you've bought, you tend to be more careful and as to the quality of the product. This is a key factor. So at the moment, we have very closely matched supply and demand. No one is going to turn away raw cashew nuts because they're poorly dried. What tends to happen is that they just give everyone a lower price and try to figure out the best average. And what's often mixing is different post-harvest handling. It's also mixing of crops. We know that happens from time to time. And that's the nature of the structure of the industry lends itself to that. People may say that it's just bad practice or sharp practice by RCN traders. Some of it may be, but most of it is just the way the industry is structured lends itself to poorer quality mixing, assembly of lots that have maybe not been poorly dried, but been dried to different levels, and that's causes problems down the line.
Sure. Thank you very much. Jim, I think we have gone very much into time. We don't have any further clarification that is needed now. But I know next fortnight, you'll be coming our way again. So we want you to take the opportunity to let us know what lies ahead in the next fortnight. So what should we expect as a market in the next fortnight? And then what kind of information will you be coming our way with?
So over the next couple of weeks, I think we can probably expect a relatively stable market. Keep an eye on those factors that I mentioned earlier. Keep an eye on, particularly on the farm gate prices in West Africa on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the development of the situation in India. I don't expect huge volatility in the next 2 weeks, but it's always possible, of course. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk, as usual, about the market, and we're also going to talk about consumption patterns of cashew kernels around the world, and to try and see, as we've tried to do today by looking at India and Vietnam, we're going to have a look at what we can learn and what patterns and opportunities are there for African processors within the current structure of consumption around the world. So thanks very much to everyone today. It's my pleasure to talk to you about cashews, and I look forward to talking to you again in 2 weeks. Thank you, Ernest.
Thank you very much, and see you again in 2 weeks. And by the way, thank you also to all of you participants. Next week, we are coming your way with another presentation by Shakti Pal, who is going to be talking about market compliance. For processing, this is very key, and we hope you find time to be with us. So to come your way again next week, Wednesday on the 19th, with the market compliance, and then the fortnight from now with Jim Fitzpatrick. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you very much, and bye-bye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.
Hi, I'm Salma. I'm the CEO of Ivoirienne de Noix de Cajou. Today, cashews are faceless, and our aim is to give cashews an identity. More than 40% of raw nuts in the world are produced in Ivory Coast, and we believe the cashew identity should be African. So we set up this factory to connect the value chain between the farmers and the consumers. The farmers are fragmented and the consumers are disconnected.
Sergio, ben arrivé.
Passez bancaille non blanc, nous prenez belle trois fées.
Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, Tibaï, aïe, fout moins content. Sorti à tête royale, moins du non blanc débarqué.
Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, aïe nous ja swingé.
Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, yeppa, ou ba nous les news.
Sergio, ben arrivé.
Non blanc arrivé, aïe moins content. J'ai mon tombé. Non blanc pas les payer. En moins benae. Ou crier bena soufflé. Bena kassamongo. 100 fois. Mon bani la hamba, mon pas les baons, mon bani comme bana hamba deux. Pas les bains la hamba, mon pas fait bail. On va dans la personne, mon bani la hamba. Moi qu'elle